It's Saturday, July 4th, 2026.
Yeah, happy 4th?
Thanks.
Mhm.
And, if you step outside tonight, literally anywhere in the country, you are going to see the sky just lighting up.
Oh, absolutely. Fireworks everywhere.
Right. Fireworks, the parades, the cookouts. It's this massive public celebration of these grand ideals of democracy and independence. And when you look up at that very visible display of civic virtue, it feels deeply reassuring.
Hmm.
Like we naturally want to believe that power, especially when it's wrapped in a flag, is inherently noble.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really comforting narrative. We build monuments to these ideals, right? And we teach them in civics classes. We really want to believe that leaders are fundamentally motivated by the national interest, by a desire to, improve the lives of the people they represent.
Right, but when you actually look past the fireworks, when you start peering into the real mechanical engine room, how governments and organizations actually operate, suddenly that beautiful, noble display starts to look a lot more like a stage play.
Yeah,
Because down in the engine room, the machinery of power operates on a completely different set of rules. And those rules are, honestly, incredibly cynical.
it's the ultimate political reality check, honestly. The mechanics of power, they don't care about ideology, they don't care about morality, they care about one thing, and that's survival.
Exactly. And today we're taking a stack of excerpts from this truly fascinating, deeply provocative book called The Dictator's Handbook.
By Bruce Bueno de Mesquita and Alastair Smith.
Right. And we are going to use their research to completely shatter the illusion that ruthless dictators and, beloved democratic leaders are fundamentally different species.
Because they really aren't.
No. Instead, we're extracting the ultimate cheat codes of power to understand the underlying math of leadership. Because once you understand the mechanics, you realize why bad behavior is, well, almost always good politics.
Which is a really heavy paradigm shift for anyone who follows politics or business.
Oh, for sure.
But once you grasp this framework, it kind of strips away all the noise. You stop looking at what leaders say, and you start looking entirely at what they need to do to avoid being overthrown.
It's going to change how you view your local mayor, your CEO, and the people running nations on the global stage.
Mm-hmm.
But to even begin to understand how leaders survive, we have to start by destroying a very persistent myth.
The myth of the absolute ruler.
Yes.
Right.
We have this image in our heads of the solitary tyrant, right? Just bark orders from a throne. But no one rules alone.
Not a single person in human history. I mean, take France's King Louis XIV, right? The Sun King.
Right.
He supposedly declared, I am the state. But even with all that concentrated wealth and supposed divine right, he couldn't rule unilaterally.
Because he couldn't be everywhere at once.
Exactly. He still needed the military to enforce his will, and he needed aristocrats to actually collect his taxes. No leader is a monolith. And this brings us to the foundational math of power in the source material, a concept called Selectorate theory.
Okay, let's unpack this. Selectorate theory.
Yeah. It basically argues that you can understand the behavior of any organization on Earth, any at all, by looking at 3 specific groups of people.
Okay, so if I'm looking at an organization, say like a country, who is the first group?
The first group is the nominal selectorate, or the authors also call them the interchangeables.
The interchangeable.
Right. This encompasses absolutely everyone who has a legal say in choosing the leader. So in a modern universal democracy, this would be all registered voters.
Right, but this also applies to non-democracies, doesn't it? Because, in the old Soviet Union, they still held elections. Millions of people went to the polls.
Precisely. In the Soviet Union, all eligible voters were part of the nominal selectorate, even though those elections were a complete sham with only one candidate on the ballot.
Right, you're just sort of dropping a piece of paper in a box.
Yeah, you have a theoretical toe in the door, but you have no actual tangible power to change the outcome. You are completely interchangeable.
Okay, so if the interchangeables are just this massive pool of people at the bottom, there has to be a smaller group that actually narrows things down.
There is. That's the second group, the real selectorate or the influential.
Influentials, okay.
These are the people who actually have the power to choose the leader. So in the U.S., it's the voters who actually bother to show up on Election Day and cast a ballot.
Ah. Oh.
In a system like Saudi Arabia, it's the senior members of the royal family and key religious clerics. They are the ones whose opinions actually register in the system.
So if the influentials cast the ballots or make the actual selection, they have to be the most important group, right?
Yeah.
Like, keep them happy and you win.
Not exactly.
Wait, really?
Yeah, because hidden within that group of influentials is an even smaller, much more critical subset. The third group, the winning coalition, or the essentials.
The essentials.
Right. This is the absolute mathematical minimum number of people whose support directly translates to you taking power. Ah, I see. So in the U.S., it wouldn't just be the majority of all voters. It would be the specific distribution of voters across specific states needed to reach exactly 270 electoral college votes.
Right. You don't need everyone. You just need that winning coalition.
Yeah.
And in a military junta, it might just be 4 or 5 generals who control the most heavily armed battalions in the capital city.
Wow. I really love this framework because it makes something abstract incredibly tangible. It's kind of like looking at a massive corporate org chart, right? You have thousands of entry-level employees. Those are your interchangeables. You have hundreds of mid-level managers who have some say your influentials. But then you realize that only 5 people sitting on the board of directors actually have the legal authority to fire the CEO.
Right, exactly.
Those 5 individuals are your essentials.
And in that corporate org chart, the size of that board of directors changes absolutely everything about how that CEO is going to behave.
How so?
Because it dictates what the authors call the public goods versus private goods dynamic. Okay, how does that dynamic actually work in practice?
Think about it as a matter of simple accounting. If your winning coalition, your essentials, is tiny, like in a dictatorship or our corporate board example, the cheapest and most efficient way to ensure they never fire you is to buy their loyalty directly with private
goods, so like bribes.
Basically. Direct cash transfers, lucrative government contracts, Swiss bank accounts, legal immunity. You just funnel the wealth of the organization directly into the pockets of those few key generals or board members.
But you can't do that if you lead a sprawling democracy.
Exactly.
Because your winning coalition isn't 5 generals, it's 50 million voters.
Right.
There literally isn't enough money in any treasury on Earth to hand $1 million check to every single person who voted for you.
The math just completely breaks down. So a Democratic leader has to buy loyalty using a completely different currency. They provide public goods.
Like infrastructure.
Yeah, things that everyone can enjoy simultaneously. Interstate highways, clean drinking water, national defense, public education. The fundamental goal of the leader is the exact same. Buying enough loyalty to stay in power, but the sheer size of the coalition forces them to invest in the actual country instead of just bribing individuals.
That completely strips the morality out of it. Like, we think democracies are inherently more moral, but the authors are arguing that democratic leaders provide clean water not because they're saints, but because it's literally the only mathematically viable way to pay off 50 million essentials at once.
It is pure structural incentives. Whether you're a benevolent president or a ruthless tyrant, you're just reacting to the size of your winning coalition.
So once you understand who holds the keys to power, the question becomes, how do you manipulate them? The source material details this survival strategy, essentially the dictator's playbook.
Yeah, there are 5 practical rules.
So let's walk through how a leader secures their grip, starting from the moment they take charge. Rule 1.
Well, if you've internalized the math we just discussed, the very first instinct of any leader trying to secure their position is obvious. Shrink the group of people you have to keep happy.
Rule 1. Keep your winning coalition as small as possible.
Right. You want to reduce your essentials to the absolute bare minimum. Fewer essentials means fewer people you have to bribe, which leaves a lot more discretionary money in the treasury for the leader to keep for themselves.
But wait, shrinking that inner circle creates a massive new problem, doesn't it? If you're relying on just 5 generals to stay in power, those 5 generals suddenly have all the leverage.
Oh, they definitely do.
They know you need them. So how do you keep them from constantly demanding more money or, threatening to replace you?
That's where Rule 2 comes in. You flood the system with potential replacements. You keep your nominal selectorate, the interchangeables, as large as possible.
Which explains Lenin's strategy in the Soviet Union.
Exactly. Lenin perfected this. He utilized rigged universal elections where millions of people voted.
Right. And by letting millions of citizens technically participate in the political process, he was sending a direct psychological message to his inner circle. He was essentially telling his generals, look at all these millions of people out there. If you ask me for too much money, I can easily pluck a loyal factory worker from that crowd, give him your job, and pay him half as much.
It instantly neutralizes the leverage of the elites. It is a brilliant mechanism for inducing paranoia. You make the inner circle acutely aware that they are entirely expendable.
That is so dark.
It is. But to maintain this delicate balance of terror and loyalty, we arrive at the lifeblood of the entire operation. Rule 3. You have to control the flow of revenue.
Control the treasury.
Right. It is vastly preferable for a ruler to determine who eats than to govern a prosperous, independent society where people can feed themselves. You want all the wealth of the nation flowing directly through your hands so you can distribute it as patronage.
And when you are distributing that patronage, you have to hit a very specific sweet spot, which is Rule 4. You have to pay your essentials just enough to keep them loyal, but not enough to make them independent.
Because if you make a general too rich, he no longer needs your patronage. Worse, he might use that independent wealth to fund a rival and replace you.
Right, you want them living lavishly, but entirely dependent on your continued survival to maintain that lifestyle.
Which leads to the final, darkest rule of the playbook. Rule 5. Never take money out of your supporters' pockets to improve the lives of everyday people.
Because hungry, disorganized masses are generally too weak to overthrow a heavily armed state. But a disappointed coalition member, a general who didn't get his expected payout.
Oh, he will orchestrate a coup before breakfast.
Exactly. And this dynamic of relying on payouts reveals exactly when these leaders are most vulnerable to being overthrown. The sources note that a leader's terminal illness is the absolute best time for a rival to strike.
Because loyalty in these systems isn't based on friendship. It's not based on ideology. It is essentially a down payment on future rewards.
Right. So if your inner circle knows you have terminal cancer, they know the checks are going to stop bouncing very soon.
The patronage network instantly unravels. The essentials look at a dying leader and realize they can no longer guarantee their wealth or their safety, so they immediately start shopping for a new patron.
A new leader they can install to protect their position.
Exactly. And the historical examples of this mechanism in action are just incredible. Look at the Shah of Iran in the late 1970s.
Okay.
He had massive oil wealth and a fearsome secret police, but he secretly developed cancer. Once it became clear to his inner circle that he was dying and couldn't secure their long-term future, his elite military backers just abandoned him.
Wow.
That completely opened the door for Ayatollah Khomeini to return and seize power. Or look at Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines in the 1980s.
Right. Marcos is a textbook case. He was dying of lupus. And his backers, the military and the oligarchs, saw the writing on the wall. They knew a dead man couldn't deliver rewards. And that systemic weakness allowed Corazon Aquino to step in, rally the opposition, and take over.
The moment the guarantee of future payment vanishes, the dictator's power vanishes with it.
Okay, I have to push back a little here.
Sure.
Because this incredibly Machiavellian survival of the fittest math, it makes total sense for a warlord or, a dictator like Samuel Doe in Liberia. But do politicians in modern democracies really operate using this exact same playbook?
What's fascinating here is they absolutely do.
Really?
Yeah, they're simply constrained by the laws and the institutions of their specific countries. Think about the first step, shrinking your winning coalition. Why do politicians and democracies fight so viciously for the right to gerrymander electoral maps?
Oh, because they aren't trying to win more voters. They're actively trying to redraw the district lines to shrink their winning coalition, so they have fewer constituents they actually have to satisfy to stay in office.
Exactly. They are choosing their voters rather than letting the voters choose them. It's the dictator's first rule, adapted for a legal framework.
That makes a lot of sense.
And look at how they control revenue and reward their supporters. I mean, objectively speaking, you see this exact same strategic math across the entire political spectrum in the U.S.
Okay, give me an example.
Well, Republicans historically push for tax cuts, which directly financially benefits their specific coalition of voters and corporate backers. Democrats historically push for expanded welfare and social programs, which financially benefits their specific coalition of voters.
Right. It's the same mechanic. Both sides are using the national treasury to reward their essential coalition at the expense of the opposing party's voters.
It really is the exact same playbook, just with different referees.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because if you want to see just how easily these dictatorial rules can completely infect a democratic system, we can look at a shocking real-world example from American local politics.
The story of Bell, California?
Yes. This story blew my mind. The sources detail the tenure of Robert Rizzo, who was the city manager of Bell. Now, Bell is a small, working-class, relatively poor suburb of Los Angeles. Yet after 17 years in office, Rizzo was making a staggering $787,000 a year.
To put that in perspective, he was making significantly more than the president of the United States. And he was doing this in a town where more than a quarter of the residents lived below the poverty line.
So how does a city manager in a poor suburb pull off a heist like that without a literal army backing him up? Like, why didn't the voters just immediately recall him?
Because he weaponized the rules of political survival.
Hmm.
He fundamentally altered the math of his coalition. In 2005, the town held a highly technical special election to change Bell from a general law city to a charter city.
Okay, what does that mean?
Basically, this change meant that city decisions could be made behind closed doors, completely free from state-level salary caps.
But the brilliance, the dark brilliance of it was the timing. By holding a special election that nobody understood or paid attention to, out of 36,000 residents in Bell, only 390 people actually turned out to vote.
It's a dictator's dream scenario, a 1% voter turnout. By slipping this through, Rizzo perfectly executed the first rule. He drastically shrank his winning coalition. The everyday citizens of Bell were effectively removed from the equation.
So who was left?
The only people who actually held power over him, his absolute essentials, were just the 5 city council members.
And he secured their absolute loyalty by paying them off. 4 of those 5 council members were suddenly making nearly $100,000 a year for sitting on phantom municipal boards that rarely, if ever, actually met.
Right, he bought their silence with private goods.
But buying loyalty requires immense cash, which brings us to extracting the revenue. To fund his huge salary and the council's payouts, they relentlessly jacked up property taxes. The sources note that a homeowner in this working-class suburb of Bell was paying property taxes at a rate 50% higher than someone living in the wealthy oceanfront enclave of Malibu.
It's just astonishing extraction. And what's terrifying is that the system didn't naturally correct itself. The voters of Bell didn't rise up and fix it because the closed loop of the math worked perfectly.
A tiny coalition allowed the leader to tax the poor to feed the rich, ensuring absolute loyalty from the few people who could fire him.
Exactly. Rizzo only fell from power because an external shock, an outside journalism investigation by the LA Times, exposed the phantom meetings and brought in state prosecutors. Without that outside force, he could have kept running that micro-dictatorship forever.
It maps perfectly onto totalitarian mechanics. And if a small municipal government can operate like a dictatorship, we have to look at the places where most of us spend our waking hours, the corporate world.
Oh, yeah. The authors apply this exact same framework to publicly traded companies, and it completely reframes how you look at business.
Let's dive into the corporate playbook. The sources highlight Carly Fiorina's tenure as the CEO of Hewlett-Packard, starting in 1999. In the context of a massive corporation, the millions of everyday retail shareholders are the interchangeables.
Right. They have a vote, but no real power.
And the winning coalition, the essentials, is the board of directors.
And when Fiorina arrived at HP, she inherited a board of 14 members. Crucially, many of those members were insiders and family members of the original founders, people like Walter Hewlett and David Woodley Packard.
And because those founders' families owned massive amounts of stock, they cared immensely about the overall stock price. And a high stock price is a public good, right? It benefits all shareholders equally. They weren't interested in private perks like minor increases in board compensation.
Exactly. And because they demanded public goods and couldn't be easily bought off with private bribes, they were a direct threat to her survival as CEO. So Fiorina went to work on shrinking the coalition. Over her first few years, she successfully whittled the board down from 14 members to just 10, actively removing potential threats to her power.
But shrinking the board wasn't enough. When the tech bubble burst and HP's stock tanked, the remaining board started to turn on her. They opposed her leadership. So she pushed through a massive, highly controversial merger with Compaq.
It was a brutal proxy battle, but politically, it was a masterful maneuver. By forcing the merger with Compaq, she created a structural excuse to shuffle the essential deck. She brought 5 new Compaq loyalists onto the newly formed HP board. She essentially diluted the power of her opposition by expanding the board with her own cronies.
So it's like corporate governance is a ruthless game of musical chairs. The CEO is controlling the music, and she intentionally removes the chairs of the board members who might vote against her, while simultaneously pulling up chairs for her allies.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, publicly traded companies often mimic those rigged autocracies. You have millions of retail shareholders, the massive nominal Selectorate, who receive their proxy voting cards in the mail and think they have a say. But the real power is completely monopolized by a tiny, packed board of essentials.
In the most revealing detail of the HP story, right after the Compaq merger went through, While the company's stock was still slumping and everyday shareholders were losing money, board compensation mysteriously doubled to over $200,000 a year.
A classic private good payoff. The company is bleeding, but the essential coalition gets a massive raise to secure their loyalty during a crisis. It's the Robert Rizzo playbook, just executed in a boardroom.
We've talked about how they shrink the inner circle and how they pay them off, but buying all this loyalty requires an incredible amount of cash. Which brings us to the most dangerous part of this game, taxation and foreign aid.
Extracting revenue is a delicate, high-wire act for any leader. The authors argue that autocrats aim for the maximum revenue point. They want to extract as much wealth as mathematically possible from the population to enrich their small coalition.
Right.
Democracies also overtax, but they are heavily constrained. Because their coalition is so large, millions of voters, if they tax too much, they will alienate the very people they need to survive the next election.
The numbers in the text illustrate this perfectly. If you compare the United States to China, a working-class family making $32,400 a year in the U.S. pays zero federal income tax. In fact, with child tax credits, they might actually get a check back from the government. But in China, that exact same family making $32,400 pays over $6,700 in various taxes.
And the mechanism behind that disparity is simple. The Chinese leadership does not need the political support of that working-class family to survive in office. So they aggressively extract the wealth from that family to pay off the Communist Party elites and the military officers who actually keep them in power.
And furthermore, if you manage to generate massive wealth in an autocracy without being a formal part of the winning coalition, you are in grave danger.
Oh, absolutely.
Because independent wealth threatens the ruler's monopoly on rewards.
Yeah.
The book highlights Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was once Russia's richest man running the Yukos oil company, and Huang Guangyu, who was China's richest man, having built a massive retail empire.
Oh.
Both of these men were imprisoned the moment they showed political independence or fell out of favor.
In a dictatorship, wealth without absolute groveling loyalty puts a massive target on your back. And this deeply cynical logic extends seamlessly into how nations handle foreign aid.
How so?
Well, when democratic leaders distribute foreign aid, they're usually trying to buy policy compliance from foreign governments, maybe to secure a trade deal or military access to satisfy their own voters back home. But when dictators receive that foreign aid, they don't use it to build schools or infrastructure.
They immediately convert it into private goods. They take the aid money and buy luxury cars, weapons, and Swiss bank deposits to pay off their winning coalition.
Yep.
The aid rarely, if ever, helps the oppressed citizens it was intended for. It just props up the dictator.
It basically acts as an artificial revenue stream that allows the dictator to avoid developing their own country's economy.
But this brings up a huge mechanical question for me. If a dictator's only goal is to maximize the money they can hand out to their cronies, why don't they just tax their citizens at 100%? Like, why not just confiscate absolutely everything?
It all comes down to the mechanics of the economic pie. If you tax a population at 100%, taking every single cent they earn, they have absolutely zero incentive to work. Or worse, the sheer desperation forces them to actively revolt.
So the whole system collapses.
Exactly. The economic pie shrinks to nothing, and the dictator is left ruling over dirt. A dictator needs the people to work just hard enough to generate wealth, so they calculate the breaking point. They tax right up to the very edge of maximum extraction, taking as much as possible without triggering total economic collapse or a violent revolution.
It is a cold mathematical squeeze.
It is.
Okay, let's pull all of these threads together. Because when you look at the broad sweep of history, you see this framework everywhere. Earlier you mentioned Pope Damasus I in the 4th century.
Right. Pope Damasus secured his papacy through literal street battles, violently shrinking his essential coalition of bishops and elite backers so he wouldn't have to share power with a rival faction. He consolidated church revenue, paid off the Roman elite, and essentially established the Playbook early on.
So what does this all mean? Whether we're talking about a 4th century pope, a modern CEO fighting a proxy battle at HP, a city manager in a small California town, or a global autocrat, power is ultimately just about math. It is about managing the essentials, the influentials, and the interchangeables.
The labels of democracy or autocracy are almost just window dressing for the underlying coalition size.
That is the core insight. We get distracted by the flags and the speeches, but it's really just a sliding scale of how many people a leader is forced to pay off.
Exactly.
I want you, listening right now, to take this framework into your life tomorrow. Look at your own workplace org chart. Look at your local city council or the national government through this new lens. Who are the true essentials in that room? Who is being quietly paid off with private goods? Because once you see the matrix of how power actually sustains itself, you really can't unsee it.
And that leaves us with a final, rather haunting paradox to mull over. The authors argue that the only way to truly fix a broken, corrupt system is to increase the size of the winning coalition. If you force a leader to rely on thousands or millions of people, you force them to provide public goods instead of private bribes.
Right.
But here is the paradox. How do you possibly convince the people currently in power to expand the coalition when doing so guarantees they will lose their exclusive wealth and their iron grip on control?
Wow. If the people in power will never willingly dilute their own power, is true reform completely impossible from the inside? Will it always require some kind of massive, uncontrollable outside shock like a technological revolution, a total economic collapse, or an investigative journalist to force the doors of power open?
It's a daunting thought. The rules to rule by are incredibly resilient because human self-interest is incredibly resilient.
It really is. So tonight, as you watch those fireworks exploding in the sky, celebrating the grand, noble ideas of democracy, maybe take a second to think about the invisible, cynical machinery operating down here on the ground. The math, the coalitions, and the very human drive to survive at all costs. Keep questioning those hidden rules of the world around you. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.